I had this sort of general idea that I want to ask you about the role that hope plays in particularly in this film, in the Iron Ministry. I don't know if you can say something about that.
Yeah, I guess you're kind of talking about hope expressed by people in the film, or the film itself, or?
I don't know. I mean, I was thinking about it in all kinds of ways, like the idea of the train moving forward, and China as a country, perhaps, and also the people riding that train, or in any sense.
So we can talk about it in terms of the train system in China first. Like, do you guys know that China has this train system? They're building these high-speed bullet trains that make America look like we're trapped in the 19th century in terms of technological progress and this kind of thing. And there's train rides between cities in China that are as far apart as San Francisco and here that you can cross in 12 hours, and versus what used to be like a 3-day train ride. And so you have this really kind of like national project of ambition and technological progress to build the biggest, the fastest, the best railway system in China. And it's mostly relegated to the eastern seaboard, and there's lots of debates about how valuable that is as an investment, because there's a whole swath of the country where the trains are not that upgraded or updated. And so there's this sort of uneven distribution of the idea of hope or of ambition. And then that ambition, as we know, like every technological advancement, there's a whole theory of like how that brings together a lot of risks and uncertainties and anxieties, right? With each technological advancement, we're kind of smuggling in or bringing in these inherent or unforeseen but inherent risks. For example, maybe you read about it in the news, maybe you didn't. There was 2 high-speed trains in China that collided between Shanghai and Xiamen. There's a city called Wenzhou, and these 2 trains collided near Wenzhou, and people died, and they buried the trains before the sort of rescue effort was completed, and it ignited all of this discussion and anger from Chinese citizenry on the interwebs and social media, on microblogs, talking about like, okay, it's great that we have this desire to achieve a kind of like national greatness, but we're not thinking about the human costs or the kind of the risks involved. And so there's this kind of national hope, but then there's the individual hope of individuals. And I'm thinking of the woman who's sitting by the train window looking out, and she's talking about leaving her life in the southern factories and going to see her new potential boyfriend, it's kind of vague, in Suzhou, and starting a new life in this other city. And she has a lot of like mobility and hope and desire that's sort of also mirrored in the train's ability to move and bring together these vast regions. So you have that as well, but you also have people speaking about a particular kind of hope for a kind of harmonious society, which was the former ruler Hu Jintao's sort of contribution to Chinese cultural and political ideas, was that China could be this harmonious society of people getting together, and if whether you're Tibetan or you're a Uyghur Muslim or you're Han Chinese atheist or you're a Buddhist or you're a Catholic, that all these different walks of life and ideologies could mix together. And that's also like spoken by those guys who are sort of defending Chinese national sovereignty when those 2 Muslim guys are speaking. So I think it's interesting that you talk about hope, because when I was making the film, and I work a lot with Chinese independent filmmakers and this independent film world. So when you guys are thinking about independent cinema in the US, we think about people who are removed from sort of big studio resources and like investment and big budgets, and you're working in smaller scale budgets. But in China, independent also means independent from the state. And I was thinking about not only all of my colleagues in China who are independent filmmakers, and they're dealing with increasing oppression and difficulties in making work, but I was actually more keyed into the anxiety of the transition from power, because China, during this period of this film being made, 2011, 2013, was when Hu Jintao, the leader, was stepping down and Xi Jinping, who's now the leader of China, was taking over. And anytime there's a transfer of power in China, there's a kind of anxiety about what's going to happen next. And there's also just an anxiety in terms of like a slowing down economic growth, and anxiety of, you know, things as basic as like real estate markets and the sort of prospects for the future. So for me, the film was more also a study of like how this anxiety plays out in various spaces as it's sort of being expressed across the network of trains in China. So I see also that of course we wouldn't want to just make a film that was a one note kind of thing, like it wasn't just one particular message, that it's not just about anxiety, there's also this countervailing sort of feeling of hope for a future, even if, as you're dealing with the anxieties of the immediate present.
So, because when you mention this, this is a stupid question, but when you mention all these Chinese people's names and words, it's clear that you speak Chinese quite well. And I was wondering, what role does that play in this kind of filmmaking? The fact that it's not exactly like you showed up one day and you started filming in China as an American who traveled there, but you have an anthropological background, you spend there many years, you learn Chinese, and then you immerse yourself in that world. So what is that kind of process like? How do you position yourself as an American white guy in that world? What does it feel to be holding a camera under those circumstances?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, of course, and it's different. Has anybody been to China here? Yeah? Some people were born in there, maybe? Yeah. You were born there? So, as you know, like if you're a person that looks like me, you'll never be mistaken for Chinese. Whereas in this country, it doesn't matter what you look like, you can be mistaken for an American. It's only if you open your mouth and you speak with a heavy accent that people might say, oh, you're a foreigner. But if you have any particular appearance, you can still be, I guess, more or less considered American. It's a sort of like language and cultural understanding that might reveal you to be a foreigner. But in China, I'm always an outsider, right? And I'm always, I mean, it's funny, people talk about like the ethics of filming while you're in China as a foreigner, but there's also like the fact that I'm often photographed and foreigners are often photographed and you're never a part of that particular game. So that both gives you a kind of privileged position in some ways, that Chinese culture is far more hospitable than American culture. I don't mean to knock America, but we're not like super excited about taking care of people and like, oh, you've traveled so far to come here, let me invite you into your home and give you a bowl of soup and let you stay the night. But in China, you'll have people who will be, because you're so obviously a foreigner, giving you a particular kind of special treatment, which is quite wonderful, and it enables different kinds of interactions. And oftentimes, if anybody studied any anthropology, but if anyone who travels, you know, sometimes being an outsider allows you to be like a sounding board or a recipient of different kinds of expressions or things that people wouldn't share. And in fact, on trains, right? When you're on a train, you're in this space that's temporary, right? You're in a social space like we are right now, but you know that in this train, she's going to get off in 5 minutes and this person's going to get on in 10 minutes, and it's people moving in and out. So that also enables a kind of disclosure, because you're not talking to your neighbor, you're not talking to your colleague, you're not talking to your coworker, you're not talking to your fellow student. It's a stranger who you share this encounter with. And most of my films are kind of focused on the space of the encounter around the camera. They're about filmmaking and the kinds of interactions that a camera and the act of filmmaking can create. And so that's a wonderful, I guess, dimension to the film. But there's also ways in which, yeah, there's things that keep me always on the outside, that there's certain kinds of ways that I probably will be forever seen and understood as a foreigner.
Like
But
it would be a very different film if it was done by a Chinese person, someone that perhaps, I don't know.
I mean, it'd be a different film done by anyone, I think.
Of
and I
course,
think there's like tons of wonderful films to be made on trains, whether it's here or it's in China. I think there's all kinds of cinema that the train produces, right? Which is what this film is kind of about, is like the different kinds of cinema that a train, like a riding on a train, the experience of it can produce. And yeah, there'll be different sort of reactions based upon who you are. At the same time, there's, as much as we want to like talk about cultural difference, there's still also like very human like connections that sort of transcend those cultural boundaries that I think still have a place in this film and in all of our acts of filming cross-culturally or trans-culturally.
But perhaps, how do you feel when you're with a camera and someone is asleep and you're like getting closer and closer to them?
How do I feel?
Well, like what's that? Because it's something that not everybody can do independently of your nationality or whatever. Like you see someone asleep, your first reaction is not like, oh, I'm gonna get closer to them with a camera and film them and hope they don't wake up, or I don't know.
Well, you see someone wake up in the film who I've been filming while they're sleeping. So everyone else that I was filming with a camera about this big. It's a TM700 Panasonic. It's fully manual. It's HD, and it's not too expensive. It's $700, and it's obvious that it's a camera. So obviously recording is going on. But I was filming also people who while they were sleeping, and so that's kind of like a de facto hidden camera, right? Like they don't know that I'm filming them. So what are the ethics involved in that? And there's been people who say things like either you're a filmmaker or you're a moralist. And I don't believe in that dichotomy necessarily, but I also don't believe that we should be always censoring ourselves about image making. I think we're always around, situations where we're being filmed and there's images being captured of us. We're voluntarily given our images over social media, over YouTube, over Facebook, over whatever kind of
Are we allowed
snapshot.
to film you?
Yeah, of course, I don't care. And that's the thing, like I don't care who films me at any moment, and who knows what kind of surveillance cameras we've walked under. And I maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like the shots of people sleeping are kind of beautiful. They're kind of sculptural. Like it's about light. It's about a particular state of release, a particular state of like enduring the process. The film is a lot about like just like you had to sit here and share time and share humanity together. You're kind of in a train car scenario. Like you guys are kind of smashed together in this seating, more like a high-speed train in China, like an airplane all facing one direction, going forward, versus the green skin trains, the collectivist era trains, the older trains in China where people are facing each other. It's kind of like us right now, compelled towards this kind of, I'll fall asleep on your shoulder, I'll share a wine with you, we'll share some, spicy tofu together. But in terms of filming people while they're sleeping, I think the only people that I sort of get closer to are the guys who are snoring really loudly. Do you remember the fat guys? And maybe you slept while they were sleeping, which is great. My favorite films are films that I can fall asleep in and then wake up to and have a new encounter with them. But the guys that starts off on the toes and it sort of goes around, they're snoring. Those guys, I wasn't planning to film them. I was stuck on that train in the compartment with them and their feet smelled really bad and they were snoring. I couldn't sleep. So that was like my one maybe ethically problematic scene because I was sort of filming out of like, okay, you guys are keeping me awake with your snores. I'm going to film you. And if you wake up, you wake up. I don't know. I'm not so precious about my own image. And so maybe I'm unfortunately projecting that on others. But I think it's out of a kind of a cinema of affection rather than sort of extraction or exploitation.
Most of the film, you're moving with the camera in a way that the camera has its own agency. It's not like you see a movement and then the camera follows that movement. It's kind of, I think, what you call embodied camera. That on the one side, but then suddenly you break and you frame relatively traditional interviews and you ask people, kind of quite straightforward questions of perhaps a more traditional mode of cinema. So can you talk a little bit about what drives you to do the one thing and then what drives you to break that and include these interviews? in the film?
Well, I guess the other filmmakers in the room can answer that as well. Oftentimes, the way that you interact with a camera and with film subjects is based upon like that immediate specific relational quality of the encounter. So sometimes you're filming in an environment and you're maybe drawn towards the idea of space within that environment. So you're moving through space, you want to traverse space. Other times you might befriend someone, have more conversation, and then that sort of develops into this back and forth anthropology 101. They're asking you questions, you're asking them questions. I mean, for example, the scene where I'm filming the guy's phone, I ask him what is that, and he says it's a train schedule. And then it lifts up and he asks me if I'm Muslim, and I say no, I'm not Muslim, I'm American, and then we start to speak, and then the other Chinese guys get involved. That's very much like in the moment, very intuitive response to what's going on. So it's really born of a combination of my own particular emotional or like psychological moment, the specifics of the shooting environment, and then the individual's engagement with me and with the act of filming.
But then there's other kinds of interviews. I mean, there's the ones that you meet some people and then you start talking and then they're surprised because you speak Chinese, and then there's that moment. But then there's also, I mean, I can think of two moments when the camera's, you know, and you ask either question, like that girl that you ask, you know, where are you going? And she talks about that potential boyfriend. Which is a little bit more, it feels a little bit more like not such an intuitive encounter that just happened to be there, you struck a conversation and then you film through, but more like a calculated. And that one and the one that you film and you ask about is a political question.
About Tibet?
About Tibet, yeah.
With Weisa?
Yeah, that moment.
The Tibetan novelist?
Yeah.
Well, I think with the woman who is looking out the window, we were both in a compartment together, and it was a long conversation, and at the time I wasn't thinking about it, but I think in retrospect you see her looking out the window, thinking about her future, thinking about the possibilities. She's like poised there, and she's not even really looking at me. She's less concerned about the act of film, responding to the questions and enjoying, for her, which is kind of like, you know, trains are kind of like a proto-cinema. They're like prepared us for cinema in some ways, right? We were sitting back in, if you can think back before any of us were even born, when trains were first, you know, this like amazing compression of space and time, people sat down like you're sitting now in spaces, and they were looking out windows like this, and they were sort of like watching the world pass by frame, shot by shot, landscape by landscape. And so she's poised there, and I'm asking her mostly because, you know, I found her really intriguing, having done this quite daring thing, which is to leave one's very comfortable life, or maybe not comfortable, but leaving what would be considered a stable income in China to go off and do this thing that's unknown, which is rare both in the United States and in China, to like leave comfort or leave a sure thing to go for something unknown. And so I wasn't really calculating. I think I was just responding to the moment. With Weisa, with the woman who talks about the iron dragons and the iron horses and the iron, whatever else was the iron things? I forget, she had lots of iron. Iron birds of the airplanes. She's someone I knew before. And I had gotten on the train. So at that time, because there were so many self-immolations where people were lighting them, like Tibetans, monks, and Tibetan citizens were lighting themselves on fire in protest to the treatment of Tibetan, basically like, you know, Buddhism. And a Tibetan way of life in various regions throughout Greater Tibet, which is beyond just the Tibetan Autonomous Region, but also includes a couple other provinces neighboring that area. You couldn't get train tickets to go to Lhasa as a foreigner. You had to like fly there with a tourist group. And so I was able to buy a ticket to Xining, which is a town just before you get into Tibet. And so I bought a ticket. I knew she was going to be on that train with a couple other friends of mine. And I had a no-seat ticket, so you have to like buy some newspaper and buy some rice wine and like sit down in the spaces between the cars and drink rice wine to help you like deal with the problems of sleeping against like a metal door. While she had beds, they had beds in their compartment. And so they thought they might be followed by the national security forces of China because they were under house arrest. She's a novelist and a blogger and a sort of an activist for human rights in China, and she and her husband both do this work. Her husband is a novelist, Wang Li-xiong. And when they realized that they didn't see any national security forces around, they invited me to come to their compartment. So we sat there and then just hung out for hours and drinking whiskey and talking and eating. And this conversation was just, or what you saw was just one snippet out of a larger conversation. So it wasn't like I was wanting to tell a story of what the train to Tibet meant for China. Although there was a point when I started to make this film where I started, most of the train shots, most of the shots that you see come out of me riding trains to go to different film festivals and meet different filmmakers and work on films throughout China. But then I started to take trains for this film once I realized I was actually making a film about the train system in China to some degree. And this was one train I wanted to take because, you know, the train to Tibet, the Chinese government wanted to build it for a long time, but they invited some Swiss experts on train railway construction, and the Swiss came and, you know, because they know about like building trains in icy mountains and that kind of thing in the Alps, and the Swiss said, there's no way you can build a train to Tibet. And so the Chinese said, okay, go home. We don't need you anymore, and they built the train anyway. So it's kind of like another instance of this hope or this ambition and this like, we're gonna get it done any darn way, this kind of hubris.
Okay. One of the striking things for me is that even at the end of the film, I think it's at the end that it says this film was shot between this year and this year, and it's quite a big period of time. Yet the experience of watching it is almost like it's a single train ride. And so, how do you feel about that circumstance of that cinema compresses time, in this manner, and that your experience of being in China for all of that time and taking trains in over a really big period of time on screen feels like a very different experience, like an experience of perhaps just 1 hour-and-a-half train ride.
Right. So, I mean, there's a couple of different ways to think about that, because on one level, for me, like the edit of the film is kind of like a diary for me, but that's because I'm privy to this experience of having ridden trains for 3 years and shot on different trains. And anyone here, anybody make documentaries, shoot like more footage than you actually use? Okay, so you know that like when you show your film to your colleagues, to your friends, to audiences, it's like a world opening up to them, right? Because they don't know this world. They weren't with you while you were filming. But for you, when you watch it, it's like all the experience, all the shooting, all the drives and the conversations and the preparations and the batteries that went dead and the complications, they all get reduced to this like 80-minute or 20-minute or whatever it is experience. So it's this kind of compression itself. And so, of course, there's always that kind of like mournful, like winnowing down of experience that happens when you watch a film. But in terms of making the composite, what I realize it does for audiences, what I've gotten from their interpretations, is that this film to them sometimes takes on like an allegorical or metaphorical feeling, like, oh, this is a kind of slice of life of China. He took trains all over China, cut them together, and shows us this kind of diversity and this number of questions, problems, individuals that all sort of come together to give us a kind of window onto China. And I think that's a fine interpretation. That wasn't necessarily my intention, although as an anthropologist I was also thinking about like the representative quality of this footage and what kind of picture does it paint. I wouldn't want to make a film that somehow like betrayed the real diversity in China, because we often think of China as like, oh, it's everyone like walking in one step to one sort of national goal, and there's not a lot of like individuality, and everyone's sort of like subjected to one hegemonic ideology. But it's actually not true. China is incredibly diverse and incredibly large. It's a lot like over here. People have lots of interesting things to say about their lives, and they're very aware of their environment, both political and social and economic. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it was the right move to make. I also wanted to make a film that only like through montage, through editing, through cinema, that this like a train ride that would only be possible in that way, right? And that does lends itself to an allegorical reading. But I don't know. I trust audiences are really smart. Like you guys all seem really smart, and you can sort of see that it's both maybe serving the purpose, or it can have an allegorical understanding, but you can also take each scene on its own.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions here?
Tons of questions.
Okay, when we start here.
Throughout the majority of the scene, like if there was any meaning behind it.
Yeah, so the film, have you seen the film Snowpiercer? I haven't seen it, but people, I haven't seen it either. But people talk about these two films for some reason. Like there's some people who wrote about it online. And Snowpiercer is about a film, it's a sci-fi film, right? Where the train keeps going and like the poor and back, the front is the rich, and the poor come up and they have to like, you know, throw a revolution and kill the rich people and the train can't stop. I don't know, but it's like a train divided by classes. It's sort of another allegorical reading of class conflict in the modern world, right? And it's a Korean director, right? It's a Korean director, is that right? Okay. Anyway, I didn't see the film, and yet the first shots of this film is actually from one of those higher speed trains that's spaced between the tracks that you see, and I'm like sliding along the accordion kind of interstitial spaces between the cars. So the film does jump around between different classes, but there is a way in which, especially when you have the pig liver hanging from the emergency brake and like, you know, the ribs being cut open and the hair being pulled off of the ham hocks and that kind of stuff. There is a way in which the film, I think overall, kind of moves towards this cheaper price ticket, i.e., you know, lower class spaces to the high speed trains, which you have to have a particular kind of economic wherewithal to be able to purchase those tickets. And they also present a different kind of social space, because every train car has a particular shooting environment and a different kind of social and socioeconomic space. So there is a way in which the film, I think, and this is why it also, I think, lends itself to a kind of allegorical reading, is it does move, I think, more or less from a range of different trains, especially privileging the green skin trains, the collectivist era trains, where the tickets are low and you can like open the window and smoke a cigarette, and all different kinds of modes or uses of the train, like whether you're bringing your meat to market or you're just buying it because you're a migrant worker and you can afford this train, even though it takes 36 hours, it's way cheaper than the train that takes 12 hours, and so you buy that train, and it moves towards the high-speed trains. And I don't know, maybe it would have been better to start with the more like, you know, pristine, new, super fast trains, and then go towards the what would you call like the cheaper tickets, the cheaper seats, or to mix it up even more so it didn't feel like this trajectory. But it just seemed to point towards this anxiety, and because I think the film was, you know, I don't know if you guys feel this way, but when you're like editing something, sometimes you feel like the film kind of takes over for you, and you're not really the sole author. There's something else going on. This is often talked about in all kinds of artistic, you know, practice, where like novelists talk about writing and the characters start to write themselves. So films can do that, right? And you should listen to them when they do that. And maybe it's you and like you sort of projecting your psychology and bouncing back through these other images and sounds, but nonetheless it still feels like something else is going on. And it felt like I needed to make the film work that way. And it's about, yeah, class conflict, class distinction, but also like what are the effects or consequences or possibilities that are created by this new form of transportation of the high-speed train. So I think that your question is kind of, you know, putting its finger on something that might be kind of a spine or a structure of the film.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I noticed when you went to the high-class train, they said no filming here, and just also in some of those trains, how the more wealthy people seem more isolated as well. Like they were into their own little computers. They didn't really, you know, like interact at all. And then people who were all crammed together like sardines amongst garbage and everything had a different kind of depression going on. Because it didn't seem like the people that were particularly wealthy were particularly happy either. It's like nobody was. And then the choices of food for people that were sitting on the floor was like almost nothing. There was like nothing they were offering, and it was expensive. Anyway, do you want to speak to any of that or how you felt about that?
I can't say whether or not people were happy because I didn't ask everyone, are you happy? And I can't access their interiority and their particular state. Yeah, I mean, well, when you're on I don't know, have you guys been on trains where they take 40 hours? Like after like 30 hours in, it's kind of hard. I mean, you try to be happy, and you might gotten drunk 3 times in those 30 hours, but still, like the drunk wears off, and you have to like go on with it. So there's like there's a physical kind of demand that train rides of that duration entail, especially if you're like crammed together and it takes you a half hour to climb over people to go to the bathroom, and then when you get to the bathroom you have to wait in line for like an hour, and then you finish, you come back and someone else is in your seat and they're asleep and they have a child in their arm, and you have to like debate, okay, do I wake this person up who has the child, or do I let them sleep for 2 hours because they probably also don't have a ticket, they don't have a seat, they just have a standing ticket. There's all kinds of stuff that's going on, you know, in this space of shared humanity and trying to get through these moments together. But in terms of like the offerings, it's just that everyone wants to eat instant noodles on trains, and he had other stuff. But I mean, instant noodles, I don't know if you guys have ridden a train in China or if there's a particular comfort food, but I would say like the comfort food of Chinese trains is usually instant noodles, and he had run out. And so you don't see instant noodles again until the end of the film when the guy's on the high-speed train sitting on the newspaper on the floor, and he finally gets his instant noodles and he's eating. But yeah, things are more expensive on the train. It's just like at Penn Station today, I bought this, it was $4, and I was like, really? $4 for an iced tea? But it's because you're in these particular, like, you know, locked spaces of transportation. It's kind of a logic of capitalism.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, first here, and then we'll go back there. It's okay. So Ian. And then,
What was your reaction to not being able to film in certain areas, like being rejected from entrance?
I kind of just get used to that. So you asked the question about the more wealthy spot. Actually, that was not that was the dining car of a train. And the dining car is where the train workers and train chief and train police usually congregate and smoke cigarettes. They sort of sit in one of the booths because it's a comfy seat, and you know they can just sort of have some space. But every train car in Chinese trains has a list of rules posted. And like line number 4 is there's no filming on trains without the consent or the authorization of the Ministry of Railways. And actually, interestingly, or maybe not, but this film's 3 years from 2011 to 2013 coincides with the last years of the existence of the Ministry of Railways. And it's kind of maybe hard for us to imagine, but the Ministry of Railways in China was like a kingdom within a kingdom. They had their own schools, their own courts, their own dormitories, their own factories, their own police. It was really like its own entity within the PRC government system. And it was like a good job to have and all this kind of thing. And now it's transformed into a semi-privatized entity called Chinese Railway Corporation. And so they're trying to do all these things, just like a lot of state-owned enterprises in China are trying to make this transition to full-on capitalism. It's just a way to make it more efficient and profitable and so on and so forth. But every time I went into a train car, I was going into a different social space, and that social space was always in flux, right? So you had to deal with, like, if I'm sitting next to this guy named Nico, I have to be like, hey, do you mind if I film, and work out some kind of relationship and film with him, or film him first and then say, hey, I filmed you, do you mind? I'm working on this project, and if he was okay with it, continue filming with him. So you have that. But then you have train workers. And train workers, what's their number one desire is to keep their job, just like anybody. And China doesn't have access to YouTube. They block YouTube, just like they block Facebook and all the different kinds of websites, like New York Times. And they have Youku, which is like their equivalent of YouTube. So Youku has moments where like a citizen, like our friends here, had a camera, they took it on the Chinese train, they filmed a Chinese worker like doing something that was in violation of the regulations of the Chinese Ministry of Railways. And so that person was afraid that they would lose their job because there was cases of people losing their job from this kind of, just like we see with the beautiful, you know, ubiquitous cell phone, we can capture all kinds of violations, violences, injustices, and I think we all should at all times. And as you guys probably already know, you can always film the police. They can never tell you not to film. They might try to stop you, they might try to intimidate you, but you always have the right to film. They can never actually, if they physically try to stop you, they're breaking the law. But anyway, the train workers were worried about me filming something like that. So I would say to them, okay, I won't film if you don't want me to. Sometimes they would say, you can film anything you want, don't film me. Sometimes they would say, don't film on the train, film out the window, which is why you see me like playing with different ways of shooting out the window. Although I was being very careful in this film not to show too much of those beautiful snow-capped mountains or beautiful vistas that you can get from the train, because we've seen that in train films before. So many train films, employ this wonderful imagery. I wanted to do something that was more about the guts and the kind of like claustrophobia and shared space of the trains. And then sometimes the train chiefs would come over and say to me, come to my office. And so I would like follow them, and I was scared, and maybe they were gonna like take away my SD card or like take away my camera, and I'd go in their little compartment. We'd sit down, and I'm like waiting to hear what they're gonna say, and they'd be like, so you're from America, huh? I'm like, yeah. They're like, how much does a Coca-Cola cost in America? How much does the house cost? What's a secondhand car cost in America? Can you really have more than one child? How many kids can you have? Like this Anthropology 101 went on as well. So there was a whole range of reactions, and there was always a negotiation. But if someone doesn't want me to film, if it's like if I was filming you and you asked me not to film, I wouldn't insist. If it was some sort of injustice that was unfolding and you were a position of authority, like a police officer, maybe I would. But if you're like a train chief, I of course I don't want to get knocked off the train. Sometimes I would work with them and say, okay, look, let me film, and at the end of the train ride, you can look through all my footage. You can delete whatever scenes you want. And so they'd be like, okay, go ahead and do that. So then we would sit down, they would look through the footage, and anything that had them inside, they would delete it. And of course, sometimes some footage got lost, but I felt like it was a fair compromise because I'm in violation of the rules anyway.
Kyle?
I was interested in the context of the little boy on the top.
The genius?
Bed. Yeah. Just I guess the context and I guess the meaning of what he, like if that's from something, if that's like a common thing, if that's something he invented on his own.
That's a great question. So actually makes me, I just want to say this on a side, it goes back to the question of hope to some degree, because the fact that he has this satire and this parody, whereas it can be seen as like really cynical and really dark and depressing, it's also like a sign of hope. When you can like make fun of a particular set of conditions, political or otherwise social or economic, within your social system, it's actually a sign of kind of hope, right? It's like a way to make critique that isn't so like damaging and debilitating. It's actually humorous, and humor can be kind of, productive. So when I first saw that kid, I was filming another person inside of a train car, inside of a compartment. She said, I want to go get some food, let's go to the dining car. And I was following her, and I was filming as I was walking through the train. You have to walk a long way along the train. We're moving through the different cars, and this boy was just getting everyone in stitches, making everyone laugh. And so I pan up to him, and what you see is what I filmed with him. That was my interaction with him. And so then I looked at the footage. I was like trying really hard not to laugh as I was filming. And then I saw the footage later, and I was like, oh, he's a genius. He's in the top bunk of the 3-bunk hard sleeper compartment, which means the speaker for the train announcements is right there. So I was thinking, my gosh, this young man is listening to these announcements over and over again. So then he's taken the form and the language of these train announcements, and he's pulling from the cynical observations and jokes and complaints of the adults around him, because he's like 11 years old. He probably doesn't have these ideas, but he's pulling from like his mom and dad and his aunt and uncle and his friends, and he's inserting these satirical sort of riffs on the train announcements. So I was like, oh my God, he's a genius. But then I realized he's actually speaking from rote of a folk poem joke that circulates throughout China amongst some people that he memorized and was just sort of performing it for this crowd, and they were laughing. And maybe they hadn't known it, maybe they didn't. And I thought, maybe it's unfortunate because it takes away from his genius, but I actually kind of like that it's not an act of genius, right? Because if it's an act of genius, it's like a singular moment. It's like, this kid is great, he can spin all this stuff together, but it's just this one thing. The fact that it's a satire that pervades a particular, or pervades a dimension of society, means that there might be hope therein, because it's actually like a humorous satire. So that's the context.
Was he performing for the crowd or for you?
He's performing for the crowd. But then he sees me with the camera, so then he starts to perform for me, I think, and also hide from me. As you see, like I'm floating up there with the camera, and I'm floating back down to the audience, and he's like turning to the camera and turning away. There's a whole kind of game, right? A flirtation going on.
The other question I had specifically about that was, he mentions that, like as a joke, like it's from the U.S. to Afghanistan. Is that was that supposed to be equipped specifically about like America and their foreign relations and what was happening currently, or is that more just like, here are these two ridiculously far, places, kind of like the relative distance between wherever you travel to and from?
I think it has to do, this is just a conjecture on my part or just a hypothesis, but I think it has to do with an understanding of American foreign policy. Those are very far-flung countries with oceans between them, but I think it's about particularly, because I think there's a lot of important critique that goes on outside the United States about the United States foreign policy, and China is one of the major critics of China for that, because there are critics of America, the United States. Because if you notice, China also has its own kind of way of impacting the international scene, but they do it through, hey, South America, hey, Africa, let us mine your iron ore or your coal or your copper or your gold, and we're going to build you airports and roads, and we're going to invest in your country. So they do it in a different kind of way. The Chinese government is very astute and very clear about this. Like, we're not going to bomb you, and we're not going to tell you to do democracy or to make your human rights record somehow exemplary. We just are going to help you economically, and we're going to extract what we want economically. So the Chinese populace, I think, is very clear about that. In fact, the first time I arrived in China was 1999. It was the first time I took an airplane, first time I ever left the country. I was 20 years old, 19 years old, and I flew to Shanghai, and I landed on the day that the NATO forces bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the Balkan Wars. And so I arrived during this time of protests in front of the American consulate in Shanghai, and actually was on the road, Wulamuchi Road, trying to get to where I needed to go, and we couldn't go because there were students protesting, students like you guys, protesting in the streets with swastikas over Bill Clinton's eyes on these signs that they were holding and eggs that they were throwing at the American consulate. And so I got out of the cab and told everyone I was Canadian, because they love Canadians. But there was this America, the United States is the world's police.
Yeah, back there first, and then Marcus.
So for me, politically, the central moment was when those two middle-aged guys were talking to the we Muslims, and they really wanted to believe, our country's great for minorities. We support minorities. But then you go and you problematize it with the Uyghur kid that basically gets arrested, and the Tibetan novelist. Was that a central idea of the movie for you, or is that just one of the many?
It's not the central idea, but it's one of the many. Yeah, I think there's a way in which they're performing a particular kind of rhetoric of national sovereignty and harmonious society that I hope it's obvious that there's a kind of performance for the camera going on there, and there's a very complicated exchange with the Hui Muslims.
Yeah, the Muslims seem to be getting a little bit uncomfortable and trying to just ratchet it all down.
They ratchet it all down, they actually stop talking, they go back to their cell phones right at the end. There was a moment of trying to exchange and trying to explain Muslim practices, and then they realized that this was rhetoric time, and so they just took a step back. And then that is problematized by the Uyghur young man who doesn't have his ID card, who can barely speak Mandarin Chinese, that the train workers yelling at, and then the Tibetan author, dissident author Wei Si. So yeah, I felt like those scenes needed to be in there to create this kind of complex understanding of ethnic, relations in China, but also give place for the rhetoric of how those are supposed to proceed. But it wasn't the main thrust of the film. It was just one of many different conversations that I found kind of revelatory.
First Marcus, and then here.
I was gonna ask, since the train looked like a very congested and social environment, was there any violence or disagreements within the train that you witnessed, and what was it like for them to be in that area for so long, and to have a disagreement about say a chair or someone step on a foot?
That's a really good question. There are disagreements in Chinese trains, of course. And there was one that was a little bit more vocal and pushing. No fists thrown, but no punches thrown, but there was some shoving going on. I didn't film it. I was kind of in the middle of trying to calm it down. And so it did occur, although for the most, I mean, because you put people together, they're gonna have fights no matter what. But it wasn't as prevalent in my journeys as perhaps it might be for others. There was a time when I was filming, and I was filming in one of the spaces between the cars, people smoking. I was filming into a car, into a compartment just beyond us. And there was a man there who really didn't like me or didn't like my filming or whatever. And he was like, don't film me, don't film me. And I said, well, I'm not filming you, I'm filming the thing beyond you. So if you could step out of my frame, that'd be great. And so he took the nationalist stance. He's like, you know, screw you, you're standing in my country and you're telling me to move out of the way. You move out of the way, you turn off your camera. I was like, okay, I'm just gonna, he was like, you know those moments when someone starts to talk to you and you can feel like the blood starting to move in you and probably moving in them. So I was just like, I don't wanna get into a fist fight with this guy. So I just stopped filming him and moved out of the way. It wasn't that precious of a shot. But I mean, there's ways in which I think this might be true to say, although maybe other people here have different understandings, that the train system probably had a little bit more chaos and maybe hostility between workers and passengers, and maybe things were a little bit rougher. I've seen some of my friends who made films on Chinese trains or people getting onto trains where it was a more dire situation, and I think things have moved more towards like a rational ordering that helps break away from some of those possible conflicts, but they still occur because anytime you put people together, they get into fights. I mean, look at Nico's films. They're all about conflict.
Yeah.
I just want to say that, you know, when this film started, there was basically, the screen was just blank, and you could hear, you know, so it kind of like sucked you right in right there. And then you had like all these different, you know, views of tracks, and who knew what we were looking at, but we were sucked right in. So I kind of like the way everything moved in waves, and then to like the meat packing part, and how you felt like you were right in there with them, you know, you could almost smell, you know, what it smelled like over there. And then it just kind of progressed and moved, and then the people with all the heavy produce on their backs coming up. So you moved in so many different ways, and to me it was like almost like an ocean, like it just kept on coming in waves of different kinds of information, and so I appreciate that.
Cool, thank you. I mean, I think you know, you guys are, I assume most of you are filmmakers or film viewers, right? Like avid film viewers, like cinephiles or whatever. And you know, a lot of times we go into documentaries, what we call documentaries, we assume they're supposed to be like right away. Either there's a character that you're going to follow, and then it's like lots of them talking about their psychology and their conflict, or it's a social issue and there's like talking heads and people explaining the situation, and you kind of feel grounded within this linguistic, discursive space. Whereas when you begin a film with sound, you begin a film with sort of more abstract imagery that sort of defamiliarizes the familiar. It allows viewers to enter into a different kind of relationship to the screen. And you know, so you kind of hold off that realm of conception or like conceptual understanding or like language, because language is so good at like, you know, nailing things down and creating meaning. Whereas when you sort of privilege image and you privilege sound, you privilege the power of them and the open-endedness of them, you kind of allow for viewers to sort of move forward and to lean into the film, to maybe get sucked in, or to like be more active in the generation of interpretation and meaning. Whereas a lot of documentaries sort of just hit it. Like when I watch television documentaries, it's like you want to be on a couch because you're just, so many things are being said to you. You're just sort of sitting back and having to absorb all of this information. Information that's, you know, coded through language. And this is a different kind of information. This is a different kind of sensorial engagement.
And it became a totally different experience, which you appreciate, because everything's all the same usually.
Yeah. And well, I mean, I think that the history of filmmaking and the possibilities of filmmaking are still quite wide open, and I think the history of filmmaking showed a lot of different practices. It's just that there's been this kind of like sedimentation or ossification of a couple of forms. Like, this is the way you make a documentary, it's very formulaic. This is the way you make a narrative film, it's very formulaic. You follow these rules. And it's good for us to know those rules. It's good for us to make those films. I used to make really political activist films. I used to teach in prisons as an undergrad, teach philosophy. It was more like taking philosophy books into prison and talking to these prisoners about like Aristotle and Plato and things like that. And I made films that were like talking heads, and they had this sort of message and purpose. And it's great if you want to get a message across very clear without any kind of ambiguity to make films that way. But it's also important to think about filmmaking having this incredible range of possibilities and an incredible range of forms, and to explore those and then know their power and use them when you need to.
Okay, area, Janssen.
Okay, so like kind of piggybacking off of that, so how vital do you think having a political statement in a film is? And even if you're trying just to catch life as it is, like how do you make it so that you're authentically like portraying a world, although like you, as you say, you're a foreigner, you're an outsider, and like how do you try your best to authentically like show a world in which you might not know every single detail about?
Yeah, I feel that way about everything in life, that I don't know much anything. I'm kind of in awe, like everywhere I am. Like when I go into, like, yeah, just being in any kind of situation, I usually feel kind of lost. But I think that being lost is kind of a productive stance to be, because then you're receptive. You're like grasping for whatever information you can. You're trying to like, there's a Chinese saying for crossing the river by feeling the stones. Deng Xiaoping used that to explain why they started to employ capitalist practices in China, is that you need to figure out a way to cross the river by feeling the stones. But I think it's actually good kind of for thinking about filmmaking. And I never want to presume that I do something that's authentic or objective or like is real, but I like to work with the real because it's really messy and complicated and mysterious and unknown and way better than my own imagination, but it's always filtered and shaped in some extent by me. But that's the great thing about cameras, right? Is that they're capturing this thing, this messy thing called reality, that's infused with my emotions and my feelings and my psychology and my interests and my agendas, but the still is always going to escape my control, right? So it's about this like balancing act. It's kind of like dancing with spontaneity and structure, or like control and the unplanned and the indeterminate. So, and I would never want to say that like what I'm showing you is somehow like this is China, or this is like real, this is completely like life caught unawares, which is why, one of the reasons why I guess I might include myself in the films, or why I might move with the camera. Like by moving, you're playing with cinematic language, you're adopting, like I love Hollywood movies, I love the way the camera can move, I love kinesthetic. I do. I mean, not today, Hollywood movies. I haven't seen very many Hollywood movies that I like today. But like the opening shot of The Revenant, that's nice. Like it's going along the water there, and like the elk comes up, and I see some heads nodding. He just won the Oscar. I'm not lying. I like some Hollywood films. It's just that the dumb ones that you really can't get into, like when they're just made for the sense of like getting us to pay $20 to sit in a seat. But I like to be somewhere between like the kind of cinematic language of like kinesthetic movement, but also having that movement be really embodied and be really planted and positioned within myself.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Okay, when did you start learning Chinese? Like, did you learn Chinese in college, or was it kind of like, it was like brought up?
I learned Chinese. Actually, Chinese is really much easier to learn to speak than you might think. Reading and writing takes a lot of memorization, but speaking is a lot easier than like Romance languages, because you don't have to conjugate anything, you don't have to decline anything, the tenses are very vague, and there's no gender. So it like throws out a lot of grammar. The grammar is very simple. The only difficult part are the tones, and if you like hang out long enough with Chinese people and don't hang out with English speakers all the time, your tones will become really, you guys are young, like your mouths and your palates and all this stuff.
I don't think they're planning on learning Chinese.
Well, maybe they will be. I don't know.
Okay.
But you're ready to learn. Anyway, I learned by, they might be waiting to learn. It's like the new thing, right? China. Everyone wants to learn Chinese these days, it seems. But to learn Chinese, I went over there and studied when I was like 19, 20. And I was a bad student. I skipped classes a lot, and then but I took trains. I learned on Chinese trains.
You weren't originally in film?
I studied film as an undergrad and philosophy. Yeah, and at that time I went to China for a year studying Chinese. I didn't have a film camera, but I wrote a lot of trains and took a lot of notes. And writing trains, when you're locked in a train for 72 hours and you have no one else to talk to, and there's like Chinese people who want to talk to you, you're going to learn Chinese out of necessity. So yeah, the classrooms for me, the best classroom was trains. Trains and like texts, cell phone.
Let's see here, Larry.
This is more like an editing question. When, like, clearly you filmed for like 3 years, so like you had so much footage that you knew you wouldn't use. But like, I'm curious as to what your mindset was, like walking into the edit. Like, you knew you had so much footage. So what for you were like the marks that made certain footage need to be in the film as opposed to like other days?
Yeah. Well, one thing that's good to do in filmmaking is to create constraints, right? So to build in like ways in which you can create a kind of strength or a formal rigor to the film by getting rid of certain things. So as you noticed, did you see a shot of a train station or a ticket booth, or did you see a platform really from the platform point of view? No. So I got rid of all that stuff that I shot. I got rid of all the ticket sales counters, all of the train station exterior shots, everything outside of the train I got rid of. So that limits the assembly, right? So then you watch everything like 2 or 3 times, and I do the old school thing of taking notes. And it's really about like your time code, you know, like stars next to it, if you like it, like Frederick Wiseman used to do, or probably still does. And you start to watch the hours, and then after that, you just pull from the footage that like you love, that speaks to you, that I don't know, it's not like you have this already fixed criteria. It's just, maybe it's about a particular motion of the camera, about the particular embodied movement, or maybe it's about something that somebody says, or a particular like quality of light that really compels you, or a particular quality of duration or temporality. And then you make an assembly of like 11 hours, and then you watch that again, and then you start to cut away more stuff. You kill your darlings, you find associations. You get down to like a cut of like 3 or 4 hours. Then you show it to some friends, get some feedback, have them give you some critique, get fresh eyes on it, go back to it again. And then you find yourself around like 2 hours. And then for me, I kind of work more in like a subtractive way, like the idea that you should keep cutting until if you cut any more, you've like damaged some sort of core or heart to the film, rather than like this quality of like accretion or like, you know, scale. But although I do really appreciate a lot of my friends in China, they make films that are like 9 hours or 6 hours. And there's a way in which having that kind of duration with a particular group of people or in a particular place develops a relationship, even though every scene is not, you know, like this amazing camera work or amazing dialogue or whatever, just like spending time, it has this kind of like novelistic sort of depth that it takes on. But I don't work that way right now. I work more in like a cut, and then you just try, you find out different resonances and associations within the stuff that's left behind. So it's really like auditioning footage without an overall structure. And then you start to find the structure, then you start to find the way it could flow together. And that's when I started to see that there was this, from the older trains and the cheaper trains to the more high-speed trains.
Yeah.
You were on a train for like 3 years. How much of that time, or like you shot for 3 years, how much of that time were you actually like on a train? Like you shot like a monthly basis or like a weekly basis?
It really depended on what I was doing. So there was times when I was writing trains for like 2 weeks. There was times when I wasn't writing trains for 2 months. I was doing my dissertation, so I did my PhD in anthropology about Chinese independent filmmaking. So I went to a lot of festivals that no longer can be held in China. Or I would go and meet filmmakers, or I'd go work on other films. And so I would take trains to do those particular things, and I would take the camera with me and film. So it's over 3 years, but I think I amassed only 200 hours. Sometimes you would be filming and, or you'd be on a train and you're just so tired and so lonely you don't feel like filming at all. Sometimes you can't stop filming, you're very excited about pig livers being hung from things that you film everything under the sun. So it would be hard to say exactly how much. It came out of life, really. It didn't come out of like, I gotta go there and film this, you know, every week I need to go film on a train. Although I think there's a great virtue in some people, like they film just, even if they're never gonna make it into a project, they film all the time. I think that's a really beautiful practice. But this was more out of like, this train ride was something I needed to do, and so I took the camera along and I filmed it. It really came out of my everyday experience.
Anybody else? Yeah.
What were some of your greatest technical but also like filmmaking challenges? So like technical challenges as you were filming, but also at like in post-production, what were some of the greatest challenges?
Post-production was dealing with the pull down of the, I thought it was actually a 24p camera, but it was a 24p wrapped in a 2997 wrapper. So like having to figure out how to use OnSoft to pull out, get the proper pull down so it was actually continuous 24p was a little bit of a challenge in the post-production. But the actual filming, I guess maybe the camera, even though it was like this extension of my body, I normally like to film with a camera more of this size or larger, where I can have also my eye in a viewfinder, because you know, you make films often just for yourself first, and then for audiences like maybe third, maybe second is for the people who are in your film or whatever. But like it's nice to be in that viewfinder because it's not only another point of stabilization amongst with your hands and whatever other stuff you might have to help you stabilize, but it's also like you're already in the cinema. You're in a darkened space, you see a screen, you're kind of already sitting in a cinema. But this camera, the viewfinder was a piece of crap. And so I was just sort of filmed without looking or through the LCD screen. And I'm not really into that, but it was useful for this project because I'm like sometimes giving the camera to other people and sometimes moving it around and having to traverse lots of different spaces. But I kind of wanted a camera that that could do a little bit more in low light. And this camera is just like 3 CMOS or whatever, and it wasn't super good in low light. Like you see the image starts to like fall apart. But then I started to get really into that. So you also need to embrace the technology that you commit to, right? And just go for it. It doesn't really take, this is a $700 camera. I mean, it's like, it's a camera that you're, you know, that your parents might buy to shoot Christmas, holiday gift wrapping or gift opening or something, I don't know. But I definitely felt limited by its sensor, especially when everyone was shooting with 5Ds. But I also really liked not shooting with a DSLR because when you have a DSLR, people are like super excited about shallow depth of field and like, oh, I'm focused on the tip of that person's nose, and then I change the focus, now I'm on the back of their earlobe, now I'm back on the tip of the nose, and I hate that. Like, it's just like, it's like overly excited shallow depth of field, and I really, you know, I think there's a place and time for that, and I love what DSLRs have done, but I think I might have gotten too into, I mean, it's actually hard to have depth of field with those cameras, and I particularly for this camera, wanted a little bit of drop off, but I wanted it to be quite deep and quite like, you know, amplifying of social space, rather than trying to like constrain and dig into individual psychology.
Okay, Marcus?
Looking back on the film, do you like wish you would did anything like technically different? Like, would you have shot anything different? Would you have interacted with anyone different? Would you have like, I don't know, like shot longer, maybe ridden a different train if there are different trains? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it would have been nice to shoot longer. You know, I mean, I finished the film, shot for 3 years. I basically finished the film because I finished my PhD, I was living in China at the time, left China, took a job at Cornell, was teaching at Cornell, and was teaching students, didn't have a lot of time to shoot something, so I was just editing down in my editing little suite, and made a cut, showed it to people, and they're like, oh, the film's great, it's done, finish it. And of course I worked longer, but I was kind of seduced into like, okay, now I have a film done, I'll just put it out there. But I think it would have been a better film had I shot longer, taken more trains and lived in China longer. But I also, life goes on and you just, you know, you make what you can from what you have.
I wanted to ask you one more question perhaps, and I don't know what time is it, but you can let me know if it's getting too late.
They might need to go do homework or something.
No, they don't do their homework. A lot of, and it's probably annoying for you, but I think it's interesting that you did your PhD at Harvard in this, yeah, and more or less around the context of this sensory ethnography lab, which is this place at Harvard University that you know, it's run by anthropologists, but you know, use film as their medium for anthropology. And a lot of the films that come out from that place are shot in single spaces. So you made a film, I mean a couple of films. So you made a film called Foreign Parts that was all shot in a junkyard.
In Queens.
In Queens, and then a film called People's Park, all shot in a park, and then this film, and then other filmmakers from, you know, all in a cable car, all in a boat. So why, it almost feels like it's a condition of, within that world, within that system of education, to make films within one space. And
Well, this film isn't one space. This film is a lot of spaces.
But
We're
it's
traveling
a
through
train.
space. It's a train, but it's 55 different trains that you see.
But in a way,
I see what you're saying.
No,
But
and
it's cut
also
together
when you
as-
said, you know, someone asked, you know, what are the first things that you do, and you say, okay, you get rid of the platform, you get rid of the ticket booths. It's almost because, you know, your education almost also brought you to.
Is it my education? I don't know. I mean, yeah, like a spatial understanding.
Yeah, saying, okay, the films, you know, in a way, a lot of documentary films follow, like you say, a character. So the character is what we're going after, or an issue. So the issue is being bounced around, but it's always around the issue. And these films seem to be centered by space. Perhaps it's not exactly, I mean, maybe I'm reducing it too much, but it seems like space. Do you think it's a condition of this idea of sensory filmmaking, or it's circumstantial?
Well, I think part of it's circumstantial, and part of it is a desire to go, you know, because like we were saying a moment ago, that documentaries kind of like, I think there's a kind of paucity of imagination in a lot of the way that documentaries are made. They're very formulaic these days in North America, right? It's either character or it's issue. Okay, that's great. But what about like ecology? Or what about like the space between people, right? And what about intersubjectivity, about like shared experience? What about collective experience rather than individual experience? And so I think the films that are coming out of Sensory Ethnography Lab, and I think it's not just there, I think it's throughout cinema history, you'll see people who decide that they want to focus more on cinema of place, or like an ecological cinema, not like save the planet, save the whales, but like an ecology, like understanding our experiences in our world beyond, you know, this human-centric individual person or, you know, issue-oriented kind of filmmaking, but understanding our relationship to the environment, broadly understood, not just as this thing we need to save, but like in terms of the mechanical environment, the natural environment, our relationship to non-human beings, you know, or non-human animals, and understand ourselves as animals within this larger ecosystem. So I think there's that. There's also like a polemic or a confrontational or a kind of like contentious relationship to what I would say is kind of like a kind of narrow understanding of documentary, to sort of open it up and say that, I mean, as filmmakers, don't you think that we should all be able to take a camera and make a film like about that chair and make it really compelling? Like, we should be able to be with a camera in a space and know and understand and dig into, using the language of cinema, but also our own particular interests, to explore a space and make something cinematic about it. It's very difficult, but it's like part of our training. It's part of what we should learn to do, not just follow language or follow a kind of, you know, narrative structure that comes from Aristotle's Poetics that we continually keep mapping onto people's lives over and over again. There's got to be a character who has a conflict, who has this, you know, way of dealing with it, and in the third act they resolve it, and there's this, you know, sort of resolving action. I think there's a way in which we should stretch these ideas, and I think Sensory Ethnography Lab is trying to do that. So yeah, I mean, this film is kind of about, it's kind of harnessed or tethered to an idea of a network, and that network is sort of also harnessed to this idea of the train car, and in that way it sort of, you know, rubs up against in very like, you know, analogous ways to maybe like the other films that you mentioned, like Manakamana or Leviathan, but you know, they're also quite different. But I think it's really about this kind of like redistribution or this diffusion of focus beyond just like the human or the political or the social.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we're gonna watch very likely in the fall some of the other films done in the lab, because I admire a lot of the things that you guys are doing, but also because with this kind of point of view, you realize how drastically different works come out of, because your film could not be more different than the films you mentioned or any of the films that come out of that. So it feels like it's when you step out of, you know, character or just issue, it's not like you just enter into one space, but it's kind of like opens up a universe of things, like you say.
I think it's a universe of things for all of us to explore.
Thanks for coming again.
Thank you.